Afternoon and welcome to Húsavík, Iceland. My name is Orly Orlyson. I am the founder and director of the Exploration Museum in Húsavík, as well as the founder of Iceland GeoSpace. And tonight, this afternoon actually, coming to you from Iceland live, I'll be sharing with you the story of the Apollo astronauts and their training in Iceland. Iceland is a tiny country, but we got to play an important role in the Apollo program. So that's what I'll be talking about with you this afternoon. Now, I'll also be sharing with you short clips from a documentary that I was part of making last year called Cosmic Birth, that told the human side of the story of going to the moon. So I look forward to showing you that. Now, I've been fascinated with explorers and exploration for as long as I can remember. Humans are by nature explorers, and it's just a part of who we are. There's always been a mountain to climb, an ocean to conquer, a mountain, an ocean, a glacier, or even another world to walk on. And so our journey of exploration has only just begun. We have been telling stories of explorers and adventurers for a long time, and it's important because telling the story is the first step in going there. Imagining that you can do it is the first step in the journey. And Jules Verne, for instance, told the story of going to the moon more than 100 years before Apollo 11 touched down on its surface. I come from Iceland. It's an island far from any mainland, and to settle this land you had to cross an ocean. That is to say, you needed to have an adventurous spirit, and that is what our forefathers and foremothers had. So you could say explorer's blood runs in the Icelandic people. And Iceland has a rich history when it comes to explorers. The history of our nation starts with the first voyages of the Vikings 1160 years ago. They traveled here mostly from Norway, but also from Denmark and Sweden. The town of Húsavík, where I'm coming to you live from, is the site of the first Viking house in Iceland, and it's where the Vikings Garðar and Náttfari spent the first winter in the country. This is not a Viking ship, obviously, but this seaplane has landed just about where the first Viking ship landed 1100 years before this photo was taken. And this is what the town of Húsavík looks like today. You can see that we are located right about the other side of the island from Reykjavik, the capital. But there is a direct flight every day to Húsavík, so it's easy to come and visit. And apart from running the museum and the space program in Húsavík, my family and we run the Húsavík Cape Hotel, which is probably the only exploration and space-themed hotel close to the Arctic Circle. Now, some of the Vikings that came to Iceland traveled further. This is a painting of Leif Erikson discovering North America. Erikson and his crew, they were the first Europeans known to have set foot in the American continent. But they did not stay for long. It's been said that Icelandic Vikings found and lost America. During the brief Viking age in America, we did, though, make some history. This is Guðríður Þorbindardóttir, mother of the first European child born in North America. And that is not what defines her. She was actually a great explorer and a powerful woman 1,000 years ahead of her time. And in the year 1000, she was the furthest traveled woman in the world, having sailed from Iceland to America, but having also traveled across Europe by foot to meet the Pope in Rome. This statue of Guðríður and her son Snorri is located at Glaumbær in northern Iceland. And Iceland's connection to explorers and famous expedition has lasted throughout our history. This is Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen, who spent a winter in Iceland preparing for his 1888 crossing of the Greenland Glacier, becoming the first man to do so. And he would, of course, gain much more fame 5 years later for reaching the record northern latitude during his Fram expedition. Famed French scientist and polar explorer Charcot spent a lot of time exploring in and around Iceland, making a lot of friends in the country, and would eventually actually lose his life along with 38 of his crewmates in a bad storm just off the shores of Iceland. Only one man from his crew survived. German scientist and explorer Alfred Wegener, the originator of the theory of continental drift, spent time here in Iceland in the highlands in the summer of 1912, where he saw with his own eyes the proof of the theory that he was then working on, a land that was being pulled apart by incredible forces. And continental drift is actually the reason Iceland exists. Volcanic eruptions, first under the sea and then on the new land, formed the island, and here in Iceland you can actually go diving between the Eurasian and the North American plates in a crystal clear water that is filtered through the lava. Yeah, this has to be one of the most magical experiences. Well, maybe apart from walking on the moon. These same landscapes that show how well the continents are drifting apart were actually used again during the 1960s, but that time to train astronauts for the most epic of all explorations, a journey to another world. This photo of me is from when I first visited the Apollo training area in northern Iceland. This was 10 years ago, and the 3 photos are from the Apollo field trips of 1965 and 1967. Now, growing up here in Iceland with all these stories of seafarers, I became interested in space from a very young age. I guess I was about 2 or 3 years old when I first heard of Tintin, and I guess I was 4 when I took my first trip to the moon with Tintin, Captain Haddock and Professor Calculus. Oh, and let's not forget Snowy the dog. For those of you who don't know, Tintin is a young journalist and an explorer that has inspired 3 or 4 generations of young explorers. As I said before, the first step in any journey is imagining that it can be done, and that's what Tintin and other stories have told us. Now, this is probably my favorite Tintin strip. This is not from any of his books. Artist Hergé, who was the creator of Tintin, he sat down on the evening when Neil Armstrong has set his foot on the moon to revisit his old story, Tintin welcoming Armstrong to the moon. Tintin, of course, had been there for many years. Now, through these books, I fell in love with the moon and the machines that took humans there. But by the time I was around, the moon was actually old news. I grew up during the space shuttle era. Here I am with my brother Gunnar and my sister Emilia, and I'm explaining to her the payload bay of the space shuttle. I was born in 1983, so I was too young to fully understand the images of the Challenger disaster on the news at the time. But these images affected me greatly, and later on, learning about school teacher Krista McAuliffe and her colleagues on board the shuttle, that helped me spark interest in space exploration. And 2 years ago, I got the chance to stand in front of this powerful piece of the Space Shuttle Challenger. There is no way to stand there without being moved by the sacrifice these people made for human exploration and knowledge. So, as I was growing up with no internet access here in Iceland, I read the books that my mother brought me about space explorers and space vehicles. But as I grew older, I started to drift away from the moon and develop more earthly interests. Now, that was until in the summer of 2009, when I found a book of old news stories that told about interesting events from Iceland's history. And one of the stories in this book was about the Apollo astronauts training in Iceland, near to where I grew up. Now, being born in 1983, this had all happened before I was born, so I didn't have a clue about Iceland's role in this important program. As it turned out, the astronauts who had been selected for the Apollo program were all pilots. But on the moon they needed to work as geologists, and what better place to train them for that task than in Iceland, a place that not only looks like the moon but also offers some of the most interesting geological features found here on Earth. I was both fascinated and surprised to learn that the astronaut had trained basically in my backyard. Knowing that my country had played a role in this great human adventure also made me very proud, but at the same time I was surprised that the story wasn't being told. I had to learn more, and so I've spent the last 10 years researching the field of astronaut training in Iceland. When President Kennedy announced the plans to send humans to the moon, little was known about its surface. Some even feared that the layer of dust was so thick that it would swallow the spacecraft and any astronaut brave enough to go there. But unmanned missions brought back views of the moon, giving us some clues about how it was formed and its geology. And that's what helped NASA scientists decide how to focus in the training of the astronauts. And it turned out Iceland was likely the closest thing on Earth to the moon. Iceland also offered a great variety in geology, so it was the perfect classroom. The Apollo astronauts had actually been studying geology in a classroom on a blackboard, and they tended to fall asleep during the classes. So NASA soon realized that they needed to get more creative in their training. So they sent them out looking at interesting geological sites in the US, sent them on field trips, and then in June of 1965, they sent the first group of Apollo astronauts over to Iceland for training. During this first trip, there were only 10 astronauts, and the training proved very important. They became fascinated with the geology of Iceland. They were more interested in geology. So NASA decided to organize a bigger trip in 1967, where they sent 23 more astronauts for training. And in our film Cosmic Birth last year, I had the chance to ask some of the astronauts about their experience here in Iceland. And I want to show you a short clip from the film with Rusty Schweickart, Harrison Smith, and Charlie Duke, the latter of two who walked on the moon.
Thank you very much, Orly. It's good to be back. After 50 years, we were here on our geology trip. It was a fascinating trip, one of the best geology trips I ever went on.
It was pretty clear that we were going to be dealing with volcanic materials, and so, as you well know, Iceland is a volcanic province, a very important one geologically at the intersection of some of the tectonic plates.
What do you think the other astronauts learned from their trips to Iceland that helped them on the moon?
Well, they became familiar with the nature of basaltic rocks. That turns out we were right. They're very similar to those rocks on the moon that eventually Neil brought back first, and then we all saw later.
I remember camping over here, but I don't remember that canyon behind us. And that canyon is pretty prominent.
You know, when you're going to the world's best geologic sites for either impact or for volcanic features, you're in the best areas that you could be in the world. I mean, they're almost always remote scenery, etc. Yeah, they were a highlight of our training.
The place that I've seen on Earth that looks most like the moon is the interior of Iceland, because it's all just rock out there. And if you didn't have an atmosphere, and the color's a little different, but it was barren like the moon.
Now, one of the things that the geologists did was to use the astronauts' competitive spirit to help them learn. In Iceland, they organized what they called a moon game, where they would team up two astronauts and give them tasks, and they would rate them on how well they performed. And this, as I say, they were very competitive, and this proved very useful. Now, you have to remember that the astronauts, they had their eyes fixed on the sky, but NASA needed them to be studying the ground beneath their feet. So you needed to be a bit creative. The astronauts actually did more than just train while in Iceland. Some of them went paragliding, others went to a country dance, and Neil Armstrong and Bill Anders went fishing. And I actually want to show you a brief clip also about this fishing trip that they did, and also about when Neil Armstrong returned to Iceland after going to the moon with his son Mark.
Yeah, Neil and I were good friends. I probably did the wrong thing because I found Iceland so interesting that I volunteered to go back. And Neil liked to fish, and since I knew where the good rivers were, that's when we arranged to this time do some legal fishing. I always thought he was an interesting guy. I liked Neil. Not quite as good a fisherman as me, but pretty good.
It was very unusual for me to get my dad to myself, for any length of time. And here we were there for almost a week, going out every day, adventuring, out into the Icelandic wilderness, at least from my point of view. And it was just a really special time for me. When I think of Iceland, I can't help but have all those memories come back to me. And so that's why I'm so fond of your country.
So after giving, after going to the moon, as I say, Neil took his son here to Iceland, And it was a great honor for us a few years ago to welcome Neil's younger and older son, Rick and Mark, and their grandchildren. And we took them to this place where their father and grandfather had gone fishing. And I actually brought with me here, I want to show you a few things. I have these are two of Neil Armstrong's fishing hooks. They are on display at the Exploration Museum in Húsavík, and they are from our Neil Armstrong collection. We have also here Neil Armstrong's crew pads from Apollo 11. This is an incredible gift donated by his sons to the museum. And I will be happy to take your questions later on in the broadcast about what we're doing at the museum, but also about Iceland's role in the training of the astronauts. Now, and I have actually one more interesting thing to show you later on, but let's keep that for last. So we started reaching out to the Apollo astronauts in 2013, and the first one to visit us was Bill Anders from Apollo 8. Bill was the first person to orbit the moon, and before joining NASA he had actually served in the military here in Iceland. So when it came to selecting astronauts for the training, he volunteered to go twice, the only astronaut who came on both of the field trips. And on his flight around the moon, the first time humans orbited the moon, he carried with him this small Icelandic coin. So the connections to Iceland and the exploration of moon are not only scientific, they are personal, and they are so interesting. Now, having invited Bill over opened the door sort of for us to get to know more of the Apollo astronauts. 2 years later, we invited Harrison Smith, who was the only scientist to have walked on the moon, back to Iceland. And he is a geologist, and he was fascinated by the geology of Iceland then, as he was 50 years before when he was training in the country. That same year, 2015, we invited Walter Cunningham from Apollo 7. That was the first manned Apollo mission, and Rusty Schweickart, who was the first to fly a lunar module in space on Apollo 9. And on that trip were Armstrong's sons and grandchildren. And here I am teaching them a bit of geology in the training area. Now we used the same bus that was used 50 years before, and even the driver of the bus was the grandson of the driver who drove the bus back in the 60s. This is Guðmundur Jónasson travel company. Now, we took the Armstrongs to this place. This is at Lake Mývatn, and it's an interesting place because it's a natural phenomenon. I believe it's only found in 2 places in the solar system, here in Iceland and on Mars. And me and my father, we stood on the rim of this crater. It was on July 15, 2015, with the whole family of Neil Armstrong. And on that exact moment, I looked at my clock. I knew that an event was taking place far away from where we were. It was the closest approach of New Horizons. And Mark Armstrong reached out his hand, and we all put our hands on his hand, and he yelled, "Go Pluto!" And it's something I'll never forget. So this project has led me to experience some incredible things. Now that evening, the same evening, we took them back to Húsavík, and the Armstrongs unveiled a monument in Húsavík about the training outside our exploration museum. This monument is designed by me and my father, and it has the names of all of the astronauts that trained in Iceland. With space exploration moving more and more into the private sector, we are now taking our own steps to shape that field. And we now provide training for astronaut candidates, but also for people who are just interested to learn about space. And we've been taking people back to this area where the Apollo astronauts trained, offering geology and biology training. So we are not just telling the story now, we are also an active part in what's shaping the future. And Iceland is actually likely to play an even bigger role when it comes to the exploration of Mars. Caves that are found in Iceland will play an important role in training astronauts for using caves as a habitat on Mars, and possibly if we return to the moon. They provide a natural shelter from solar radiation, micrometeorites, and extreme temperatures. So the museum is currently a part of a project with an American startup called Fourth Planet Logistics, and they have been developing equipment using these caves. And Iceland's caves are actually quite good for this. So let's see how we can play a role in the future. Now, I founded this museum to tell this story, but we have also told the story through our annual Explorers Festival. We invite people from all over the world, incredible explorers, people who have walked on the moon, people who have reached the highest mountains in the world, even people who have flown a single-engine airplane around the world, people basically that have a different view of the world. We've invited them to come. And it's interesting to listen to them talk about their passion for exploration, because even though they are doing different things, it's the same thing that unites them. It's the love for our planet, and I think that's more important now probably than ever. I wanted to tell you that I'll be taking questions later on, but I want to show you a trailer from our film Cosmic Birth. But I wanted to quote, before I do that, Harrison Smith, because as I told you before, he was the only scientist to walk on the moon, and during his career at NASA, he had this incredible opportunity to see our planet from afar. But after he left NASA, he went into politics, and he was actually elected to the US Senate, and he served as a senator from New Mexico. And he told me that every politician wants to leave their footprints, but as an astronaut, he probably has the longest lasting footprints out there, because the moon has no weather, so the footprints that the Apollo astronauts left on the moon, they are likely to last for thousands or even millions of years. But I also believe that the footprints left by the Apollo astronauts will be in a more poetic way. They will leave a legacy with us, the people of Earth, for a long time, and they are such an inspiring thing that we came together, we were able to do this, and I think this is something we can look to in hard times. This was a giant project that we undertook, and we made it. Of course, it was one nation that led it, but actually a lot of things were done with other countries as well, as for this project that Iceland took part in. So let's think of these footprints both up there, but also as a part of our history. Now I want to show you a trailer from this film, Cosmic Birth. We traveled, we filmed them while they were here in Iceland, returning to Iceland over the last few years. We had some footage from back in the day when they were training, and then we traveled across the US to meet these astronauts in their homes, and they took us to interesting places, space museums and other things. So we have been trying to build this connection more. And the film is called Cosmic Birth. The team is... I'm the co-director with Ragnar Orry Gunnarsson, who was the director, and we composed an original score with two musicians, Framfari and Ósea Borg. And I'll play you now a bit of this film.
A tourist goes on a trip and comes back and says where they've been. But an explorer goes on a trip and comes back and says, here's where I've been, and here's what I learned.
Fótspor ljósberans í myrkum mánafjöllum. Afhjúpa eðli mannsandans glóir innra með okkur öllum.
When you're born out of your mother, that's when love begins to appear, because up to that point you're simply dependent on your mother and you have no knowledge of your mother. But once you come outside, now you see your mother for who she is.
Í könnunar leit fórnir færa það sem enginn veit. En þrána læra.
I had a grandfather who sailed the sea, and I thought he was a pretty cool guy. What's it like for your grandkids to have a grandpa who actually walked on the moon? You went to space, as did your father. Do you think your kids will go to space?
He says, look, you can't decide for our children. You know, that has to be a decision they make themselves. And my retort is usually no, they're going to go. If I have to lock them in, close the door, lock it, and light that candle myself, they are going.
Það sem að geimfararnir gerðu fyrir 50 árum síðan, það á svo ótrúlega margan hátt það sama og víkingar gerðu fyrir 1000 árum síðan. Menn að fara í siglingu yfir haf, í öðru tilfellinu sjóun okkar, í hinu tilfellinu óravíddir geimsins, og menn að fórna miklu, menn að hætta lífi sínu til þess að koma tilbaka með einhverja ótrúlega þekkingu.
From Dad's point of view, that job as a test pilot was the best job he could imagine. And that's what he's been wanting to do ever since he was 10 years old. So the decision to become an astronaut was not an easy one for him.
Tunglið, það getur stundum verið svo opaslega lítið. Svo fer það að stækka og verður alveg kringlótt og stórt og svo minnkar það aftur og þetta gerir tunglið svo skemmtilegt í augum krakka.
I give you Buzz Aldrin. What's the first question you have?
Why are there no girls?
Answer the question that they couldn't possibly answer on Earth is, where did the moon come from? Why is the moon there?
I think we get to dig back into history, and then we get to say, why does this matter today?
See this whole process as cosmic birth. They took that Earthrise, famous Earthrise photograph.
Did you write this again?
Not unless it was going to land on the moon.
And then suddenly you see that beautiful blue and white Earth, and you understand intuitively and immediately how special that Earth is, and that's home, that's where we come from.
Vitsmuna fræ sem aldrei má gleyma.
Yeah, so this was the trailer from our film. Now, we made this film last year. We premiered it at Reykjavik's Bíóparadís and also on the national TV of Iceland. And actually in the film there's a sequence about landing on the moon, and it just so happened that it wasn't planned, but the landing sequence and when the actual lunar module touches down on the moon happened exactly 5 seconds from the event 50 years earlier. So there have been a lot of interesting connections in this whole process. We have some questions here. Let me see. So first question is actually about fishing permits. Okay, that's interesting. Isn't fishing expensive in Iceland? I'm not sure actually. I think it's not going to be very expensive this year. I guess a lot of locals are going to go fishing this year. But we have a lot of rivers. Iceland has so many glaciers and we have so much water. So we have a lot of rivers, we have a lot of waterfalls. So if you love water, and who shouldn't love water? It's the best thing in the world probably. You should definitely come to Iceland and experience. We have also, which is cheaper, we have sea angling, so people can go out fishing on the ocean. We did go with a few of the Apollo astronauts when they returned to fish on one of the boats on Skjálfandi Bay, and they actually caught a lot. And we put them on a grill, and we had a nice dinner. So let's see, we have some more questions here. What Iceland's future in space look? What does Iceland's future in space look like? Okay, that's an interesting question. Well, as I say, I mean, we have already played a role in space. We've played a role actually before the Apollo program. French scientists have come here to Iceland in 1963 to launch rockets to study the auroras. And Iceland, with its northern latitude, actually is important for studying some things of the auroras above us. There is a new observatory being built just half an hour drive from Húsavík, where we are coming to you live. And Iceland is currently working on applying to the European Space Agency. It hasn't been submitted yet, but the Parliament of Iceland submitted a proposal 3 years ago, I guess, that we should apply for the European Space Agency. And we have a lot to offer, not only the location here, but also the nature when it comes to testing of equipment, testing of training of astronauts. So there is much to see there. How many astronauts have I met? Okay, let's see. I guess probably 14 or 15 astronauts. The first one was Bill Anders, and then I've met 8 of the Apollo astronauts. I've met quite a few of the space shuttle astronauts, and it's always a thrill to see someone who has gone into space because these people have the ultimate stories to tell. I can tell you that. Okay, let's see if we have anything more here. Let's see, looking through the questions here. Feel free to post more questions. We are live here on Facebook and Instagram. Nice to see a lot of people who are posting here. They have actually been to Iceland, so I'm glad to hear that. Riding horses, fabulous. So we are in Húsavík, and as I told you before, we are on the north coast. We have a lot of interesting things. We have a new GeoSpace spa, which is located on the side of a cliff. So you can actually, it's an infinity pool with water that is an ocean water that filters through the bedrock and comes up through the rock, and it's heated by a magma underneath. So it's an incredible natural experience, and this pool is an infinity pool on the side of a cliff, so it can't get anything more prettier than that, I think. Let's see. How many have any astronauts brought any moon mementos to you? No, we have been given incredible things, and I have a tiny moon rock here. I wanted, though, I mentioned before that I was going to show you something interesting, and that's here. I'm going to try to get this into the frame. A few years back, we had a visitor who came to the museum, Mike Dunn, and he was interested in telling us his story. He had brought Neil Armstrong and Edmund Hillary to the North Pole, and this is the sweater that Neil Armstrong wore during his trip to the North Pole. So Armstrong's spacesuit from his trip to the moon is in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. But his sweater from the North Pole is in Húsavík, Iceland. So make sure not to miss that next time you come to Iceland. Let's see if we have any more here. We have here Nicholas asking, could you tell more about the location where you can swim between the two continents? Yes, that's an excellent question. We have in a place called Þingvellir. Iceland is the site of the first and the oldest parliament in Iceland. It's not the first one, but it's the oldest continuing parliament in the world. And the parliament started at a place called Þingvellir, which is now a World Heritage Site. And this is probably the best place. It's called Silvera. It's a Þingvellir National Park. It's about 1 hour from Reykjavik, and there you can dive into the continental drift. You can swim between the continents, and go for it, man. Okay, let's see. We have more questions here. Leslie asks, does the museum arrange tours to the training sites? Yes, we do. We have been doing this, of course, obviously with the astronauts we've been doing that, but also with people who are trying to become astronauts or people who are just generally interested in space. We did a fantastic journey 2 years ago with 5 young women who are, all of them, incredible scientists, explorers. One of them is Alyssa Carson. Maybe some of you know her. She is called NASA Blueberry on Instagram, and she is probably going to go places. We do these tours, and you can reach out to Húsavík Cape Hotel. That's the base of our operation. We have the museum nearby, and the Iceland GeoSpace office is in the next building. So this is the base of everything we do. So our business was built around tourism. We started this hotel, and that allowed us to build the museum, to bring in a lot of people. Obviously in Iceland we have few guests during the off season, especially in the north. So we have been using our empty rooms to welcome explorers, storytellers, all sorts of people to come and stay with us and work on interesting projects. So I can share my email address later here in the comments if anyone wants to reach out who is interested to come to Iceland. Okay, Andreas asks here, do you know how many people are interested in amateur astronomy, telescopic observations in Iceland? Are there serious hobby astronomy clubs, etc.? Yes, there is in a suburb of Reykjavik. There is the Seltjarnarnes Astronomical Society, and it's been since I think 1970s. a good friend of mine was the chairman of this organization for many years, Sævar Helgi Bragason. He took it upon himself when the solar eclipse of 2015 happened to raise money and give every kid in Iceland a solar shade so that they could watch this event. And we have interesting astronomical events happening here in Iceland. And of course, don't forget the auroras. Definitely something you want to see. It's wow. Okay, let's see. Sakis asks, are people still coming to train nowadays in Iceland for future space travel? So what we've been mostly doing is welcoming people who are trying to further their experience, who are planning to apply with NASA or other organizations to become astronauts. So we have been giving them a training similar to those to the training that the Apollo astronauts did, and that has allowed them to put that in their CV, showing that they have dived into this field of geology. Of course, geology hasn't been a part of astronaut training for a long time. It was a very important part of the training of the Apollo astronauts because they were visiting another terrestrial body. But after Apollo, we have been going to the space. Well, with the space shuttle, we've been going to space stations. Most recently, the International Space Station. It's actually interesting that I believe it's 20 years that there has been a continuous presence of humans in space, but there hasn't been a visit to a site where you need to know geology. So now with more focus on Mars, there's actually more interest in incorporating geology back into the training of astronauts. And some people who want to stay ahead or be ahead, they come to Iceland and we bring them to these areas and we give them the training that the astronauts did. And during these return trips and during our visits with the astronauts in the US, we have been able to learn a lot about their experience. And it's actually interesting that most of them feel that Iceland is more like Mars than it is like the moon. Our landscapes look sort of like the moon, but the geology is more related to Mars. Now let's see. Did Neil Armstrong try the fermented shark during his visit? Good question, Jesper. I'm not sure. They were pretty adventurous here in Iceland, so I guess they tried a lot. But the astronauts on their return trip, some of them have tried this. I'm not going to tell you which, and I'm not going to tell you their reaction. But this is definitely something you want to try when you come to Iceland. Okay, Diane Kirby asks, did the trainees come to Iceland more for the similarities in landscapes or scientific composition of the rocks? It was the scientific composition of the rocks. As I said before, the landscapes do look like the moon, but Iceland's geology is so diverse, and you can actually, well, as I said, we had some knowledge of what we had some knowledge about what the moon was like before we went there. We had the surveyor probes, and we had the ranger probes and the surveyor landers, and so we knew some. And NASA's scientists predicted that Iceland's geology was probably the closest to what they would encounter on the moon, but they also knew that Iceland was sort of a safe bet because you can find so many different types of geology in Iceland, so it's a great place to come and just study geology in general. Let's see what we have here now. Did the moon rocks, Diane also asked, did the moon rocks match the Icelandic geological samples the way it was thought they would? Well, not fully, but there were similarities, obviously. But Neil Armstrong actually talked about it in his biography, First Man, that he was tempted to bring a rock from Iceland to the moon and sneak it into his sample bag to have the geologists and NASA a little bit scratching their heads, but he didn't do it. Okay, let's see. So I think I've just about covered it. Rafnar Orri Gunnarsson from Húsavík says, we love water. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. So, as I say, if you're interested to come to Iceland to learn about the Apollo program or revisit these sites where the Apollo astronauts trained, we would be happy to welcome you. Iceland is an incredible place. I guess if you're a fan of Iceland Naturally, you already know that, but it's a beautiful country, and we consider ourselves lucky to live here. Of course, these are challenging times. We've enjoyed we enjoy traveling, and we've had these last weeks to look at beautiful pictures from countries that we want to visit, and hopefully we can start to travel again soon. Hopefully we can start to explore soon. Actually, the government of Iceland is currently working on a project to allow scientists to travel freely between countries. Of course, they would need to quarantine, but there are a lot of scientific projects going on in Iceland, not only in space. And next October we'll be doing the Explorers Festival in Húsavík, so if you're interested in that, you can visit explorersfest.com. We'll do a conference there about Iceland's lesser known roles in space and how space technology can benefit Iceland. We will be looking into agriculture. How can space technology make agriculture better, fisheries, and other things like that. Let me see. Gregory asks here, what is the name of your film again, and is it available on YouTube or other platform? The name of the film is Cosmic Birth. You can find more information about it on cosmicbirth.org. The name comes from Rusty Schweikart's quote that you saw in the trailer, where he compares our first steps into the universe to a cosmic birth, because then we learn to appreciate our Mother Earth. And I hope you noticed the poster also designed by artist Duska, which is an incredible picture of a mother with her womb, and it's the Earth. This was one of the most beautiful things that came out of this creative process for me personally. We haven't been able to find out how to share this film with the rest of the world. We've screened it at some festivals, and we were going to do a lot of that this year, but that was put on hold. So if any of you have any tips on how to get the film to more places, I would definitely appreciate that. You can share that in comments, or you can reach out to me. I'll put my name here in the comments below, so you can reach out to me. I'm Orly Orlyson in Icelandic, or Orly Orlyson in English. So I think that's about it. Thank you all for joining. Let me just check one more time if there are any questions that we want to address here. I think we've covered most of it. Thank you to everyone who has just shared their locations. I'll look forward to seeing where you are all from. And as I say, I look forward to welcoming you to Iceland when this is all over. And I hope you look up at the moon and let that inspire you for the next few weeks and months that are going to be hard. We have faced challenges and we have risen to them. Good night, everyone. Stay safe. From Húsavík, Iceland, my name is Orly Orlyson. Thank you for listening tonight. Bye-bye.